The next project is now on iCollege. It's been there as of about 6 or 7 o'clock yesterday evening, sometime there. Have any of you by any chance seen it? You have? Okay, a couple of you. Well, that's, yeah. Anyway, unlike this one, I did not really write the paper. I wrote a set of instructions, but don't try to edit my instructions. That's not what it's about. The paper is... here's the situation. I mean, I have my instructions there, which takes up about 2 pages. Then comes about 25 pages from 5 different websites. 3 websites take one view, 2 take another. Your job is to write the paper with your own view, depending on what you believe. And again, I say in my Jessica, if you want to see it. Okay, well, you don't have to. All right. Anyway, you can take any point of view you want to, but try to deal with the topics I list, particularly the one topic about the bodies. We found some 30 bodies. Were they buried by, were they interred? And the word interred means that friends and relatives buried them when they died. Were they interred? And again, I believe that question can be answered, folks. And of all things, Wikipedia has one view about it, but I believe you can determine whether the bodies were interred or whether they dropped dead on the streets and were covered over after thousands of years, 2,000 or 3,000 years, by dirt and dust and growth of lichens and moss and eventually plant life. All right. Leaving that, I have to admit that I have spent my time grading the first class. I've got just about all of their projects graded but 1. Yours is next. I will probably not get to do any work on yours tonight. The ones of you who turned your projects early, your grades are posted. The rest of you, I simply have not looked at yours. That is something I hope to get around to doing first thing tomorrow and throughout the day tomorrow. I got a few things out of the way yesterday that kept me from doing, including a haircut, among other things, one I noticed. But anyway, I got... All right, grades hopefully be posted tomorrow. Most of your projects that you've turned in the last couple of days are not graded yet. And also, tomorrow I hope to turn in I hope to get on iCollege the little pass quiz you're going to take today. I don't mean to minimize it. It does count as part of your grade. But I am really concerned that so many college students cannot look at a map and tell me where where Arabia is. You need to learn that, folks. It is important. All right. Leaving that, a couple of comments about the papers. By the way, one reason I decided I was not going to write my own paper, most of you took the easy opt-out and tried to edit my paper, and that got to be a little bit monotonous reading. We were just looking at the same old words over and over again, and most of you did not really make a lot of corrections. Did any of you notice that there were 3 sentences in a row that began with "in addition, in addition, in addition"? That is wrong, folks. Now, one student in the other class pointed out that my paper did not have a thesis and was really difficult to follow, and the sentences were jumbled together. That student got an A. That's exactly what I wanted to say. It reminds me of the first graduate paper I turned in, and the professor tore it all to pieces, and I got a C- on it. I mean, somewhat. Now, anyway, the logic, again, I can't emphasize enough. You all ought to know by now after listening to me. The logic that's used, I hopefully don't use. Now, something else. One sentence, one little line I included I happened to pick up from a book I found in my sister's house. My sister's husband, my brother-in-law, bought a certain book entitled Babel, and I thought I'd look at it. And it was anything but about the Tower of Babel. But it was so hard against any form of religion in schools. And here's a line in a book. The Bible teaches that man was made from dust, and we don't want our kids to learn that. Most of you didn't catch this. What is all life really made of when you come right down to it? Anybody know? What does life become when it dies?
But I think that that's a bad translation of the King James Version of the Bible. If you look at other religions, they say that we're created from the basic elements of life. And like
basic elements, atoms.
which is
Yeah,
atoms and elements.
which when we decay, we turn into dirt. I mean, well, in my way of what I've seen of living things that decay, they turn into dirt. Now, you might say they turn into atoms, but there's nothing wrong with the idea that we're made of atoms, the same atoms we'd find in the ground beneath our feet. So, but again, this person did not want our young kids being exposed to that kind of bad logic, and I have to say, what's wrong with the logic? About the ark not being able to hold all the animals, this has been checked out by many a time. Now, folks, it's true if the ark had to include 2 beagles, 2 black and tans, 2 terriers, 2 foxhounds, 2. But if the ark only had 2 canines, and these canines came the dog, the wolf, the fox, the coyote, and the dingo, 2 felines, and these felines came all the members of the cat family. I mean, I've read some creationists who are hard-credit who believe that your domestic cat, house cat, has the same ancestors as your lion and tiger, your bobcat, your jaguar. But felines, they say, only produce felines. But if it only had 2 felines, 2 canines, all the ark would have needed was 4,000 animals. And from that came all the different varieties we have today. Human beings are more alike than any other kind of living creature, plant or animal, that we see over the globe. In other words, domestic cats cannot mate with tigers, but a lot of your domestic cats have the same kind of stripes that tigers do. Or anyway, you can believe what you want to, but you, again, could the ark have held all the animals? Emphatically, I think yes. Could the 8 people have fed them? They could have if they put the food right next to the cage where the animal was. And as for water, if they'd have piped the water with pipes, and a lot of farmers do this. As for handling the waste, a lot of farmers do this. They simply put their planks apart to where the waste will fall between the planks. If any of you have been on a farm, you might have seen this done. If you, at least one head is nodding, you've seen it. And that way they would not have had to have taken care of the waste. And also, these people's abilities were awesome. Now, in a debate between Ken Ham and Bill Nye said that these people had been supermen. Well, I got something to tell you. Their descendants did not look on the survivors of the flood as supermen. They looked on them as something else, folk, as gods. Did I mention yesterday about, I believe I mentioned about the planet Venus might have broken off from Jupiter. There must have been a big solar system catastrophe because the planet Uranus is tilted on its side. Between Mars and Jupiter are about 1 million different asteroids. That indicates that the planet was broken up. And a lot of ancient records speak of an explosion in the sky, something that might could have pulled Venus away from Jupiter. Venus is the only planet in the solar system where the sun rises in the west and sets in the east, indicating that Venus underwent some kind of catastrophe. And also that heat on Venus is not caused by greenhouse effect. It's caused by a recent catastrophe of sorts. We don't know what. But the ancients might have actually seen the planet Venus breaking away from the planet Jupiter, which gave rise to the myth. Again, none of you got to that point in your research. Oh yeah, Isis is considered a fertility goddess, along with some of the other, but Minerva, most of you missed it. Minerva is not a fertility goddess. Again, I put that in on purpose, being wrong. A lot of you missed it. Let's see, is there anything else? Well, let me see, what else do I want to say about it? Oh yeah, about the Tower of Babel, folk. The idea that people can spread apart and start speaking different dialects, which eventually don't have any. In the case of the Portuguese and the Spanish, yeah, the Portuguese and Spanish once had the same language, but there are too many languages in this world, including the Sumerian, that are related to no other. How could a totally, completely unrelated language just form by the processes you named, where groups of people spread apart and start talking differently? How come the Sumerians spoke a language that did not match the written language? Everything they wrote It was like they wrote it from another language, and they didn't even know which language it was. I mentioned that earlier. None of you seem to deal with that topic. I was hoping one of you might pick up on it, but most of you followed the line that I took in my paper, which I hasten to say, I do not believe. But now you know that. All right. Anybody else have any comments about anything else I wrote? The idea that science is going to solve all our problems and explain everything. I'll tell you this about diseases, folks. In 1960, Reader's Digest wrote, by the year 2000, we'll have cures for all our diseases. I was young enough then, I thought I'll be around then, hopefully, or I'll see. Come the year 2000, we had more diseases than we had in 1960. A lot of diseases we have then today are more incurable than they were in 1960 even, even in 2015. And we still have problems with plague. Now we can deal with it a little bit better than they could, but we still have problems with plague, illnesses, and these strains of some of our diseases that are going around today, folks, that we one time could cure, I've been told we can't cure, particularly our venereal diseases, syphilis, gonorrhea. We one time could cure it. Today, I've been told that a lot of the stuff that's going around cannot be cured. Any of you have heard the same thing? Hospitals have to be more careful than ever because the infections that you can get from hospitals will kill you. It killed my Aunt Martha, where she was in her 80s. Killed my wife's father. You can pick up infections in hospital. Now that's the problem. It's getting a little better, but there's no cure for, no treatment for. So if anything, we're making progress. But as we take 2 steps forward, we take 2.5 or 3 backward. Science has its severe, serious limitations. All right. Anybody have any comments? Yes.
I felt like some of that stuff, I don't know how to correct it because I felt like it was your opinion. Whether
It was anything
truly
but
your,
my opinion,
Well,
but
but
yeah,
whether
yeah.
it was truly your opinion, yeah, I felt
The
like
idea
that
was to,
being-
well, some of the classmates wrote at the end what they thought, which was what I really wanted you to do. Go ahead. I'm sorry, I interrupted. Go ahead.
No, I mean, that was just, I felt like if I'm grading as the teacher, I'm not going to argue with your
You
opinion.
don't want to argue.
You know what I mean?
But some of the stuff used really naive, super naive logic. All right, again, I wrote it on a high school level. Intellectually, what I consider a high school level on purpose. It was not even written on it, it was using college level logic. And the girl, there was one girl in the other class who wrote down, this paper has no thesis, and the sentences seem to be disjointed. I cannot tell where the author is going with it. That student got an A. That's really what I wanted you to write.
I mean, I made a point like that I thought it was scattered.
Well,
You know what I mean?
that'll get your points in my
I
book
thought,
because...
I definitely caught on to that there was just, it was all over the place. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Hopefully the rest of you caught on to that too, and it's okay to say so. Yes?
If we just kind of rewrote it from scratch.
That was probably the best way to do it, but go ahead.
Well, that's
Yeah, what you
fine.
did? Yeah, rewrote it from scratch, putting in your opinions and scratching mine, hopefully, yes.
So you're saying somebody did write a paper and they wrote simply those 2 sentences that you said you gave an A?
No, but actually this person got an A for
Probably
other
made
stuff, but the idea was, the criticism was sound. And it was well deserving of a fairly high grade. Okay, there was more to it. I mean, this person wrote more than that, but that's just a couple of sentences. Go ahead.
So I'm asking you, did she rewrite the paper or did she write a criticism on the paper?
You could have just written a criticism of the paper and gotten a fairly high grade for it.
That's cool.
Yeah, I mean,
I should put that in the...
I didn't really put that, anyway.
Like you should write a criticism.
Wait, wasn't it just
You-
extra credit? It's just extra credit paper? Or
No,
was it-
this is part of your real, honest to goodness
Oh,
grade.
oh.
And the other one will count 25% of the grade.
Gotcha.
Yeah, or 20%, whatever it's in the syllabus, but it is a part of, it's not extra credit and it's not optional. It will knock your, for those of you who haven't turned one in, or don't turn one in, it will knock your grade down 1 or 2 letters, folks. So it's a serious matter, and I do take them seriously. That's why I'm spending time in class talking about them. Okay, I might have more to say about them later. Okay.
Yeah, just not that,
And again, folks, the idea that ancient man was primitive, if he were, how could he build the pyramids, the Nazca lines, which I'm not even sure we could build? And even your authors wind up saying that some people say the Nazca lines show that the persons who directed the project had to have directed it from space. That's even in your book. I mean, your authors just generally don't take that kind of stance. But how could they get such super straight line? And some of the other stuff you see in South America defy rational. Oh yeah, they use muscle power. I don't believe that. All they had, I mean, for instance, I've seen, even in the Encyclopedia Britannica years ago, the fact that they had not even yet invented the rope and yet could move those heavy stones. Are you sure they hadn't invented the rope? I mean, there's some kind of logic there that I'm missing.
There's a guy who recently did a study on it. He's like an architect, and was moving like humongous rocks just by himself.
Yeah.
With the like leverage. So he would like take like a ball, like a really hard stone ball, and set it on the ground, and then move another ball around it by pivoting it around. And he actually built a like life-size version of Stonehenge in his backyard, just like that, just by himself.
There are people who believe that there's a secret to stone moving.
Well, the
And a
Masons
few
say
people
that
have known that the rest of us don't know. Masons. Anyway, yes.
I feel like I heard in my my geography class that I took, or it was geology, there was something about the water that they were using, or could have used to float heavy stuff down to where they needed it.
That still does not explain how you can get around the cataracts. And so the Nile River drops off waterfalls. It doesn't explain, and there's no evidence that ever had any kind of pathway around them. It does not explain how they could get those rocks out of the water and lifted it 400 feet high. The pyramid's 480 feet high, and without a causeway. Now, there's all, I mean, I'm not taking up time. There's theories that they used a certain, they used a hollow vase, and they whistled in the hollow vase a certain pitch, and this pitch would hit the rocks and cancel out the pull of gravity, to where then a crew of men could lift even a 60-ton rock and put it in place. You look like you might have heard something about that.
Yeah, it's this crazy old dude.
Crazy. Well, and also that they might have melted the rocks down, put them in place, and then solidified the rock. Melted the rocks down with acid, and then once the acid dried out, the rocks would harden back in the same shaping. But they could put the rocks up in liquid form or piecemeal that way, and then they would harden back to the original shape. I mean, all kinds of theories.
It's like really similar to what this old Mason guy was telling me. He's like, oh, I should be telling you this. We were just drinking in a bar, and like I was asking him about Mason, like he's a Mason, and I was asking him about it. He was like breaking it down, and explaining like that thing. And then he went on further to say that it's absurd to think that any of those pharaohs would have let a slave touch their tomb, like, and that they were built by master architects only. And then
We
the
found the
architects actually
tombs
had
of the
their
people who built the Great Pyramid,
Yeah.
and they were not, whatever else they were not slaves.
Yeah, not at all. They were like master, super duper architects.
Super builders.
And they had like people that like wanted to also be architects.
Yeah.
It was like a
Now,
special thing.
I've got to move on. Did I mention about what I think about the oxen? That you get, I mean, we have revived a woolly mammoth by getting its DNA and cloning it. The woolly mammoth only lived about 3 days. We cloned the woolly mammoth and then put its embryo in the side of an elephant, a female elephant, and the elephant gave birth to a live mammoth, but they only lasted 3 days. We are trying to restore the woolly mammoth that way, and we're trying to restore possibly some species of dinosaur and find their DNA. The story about Thor touching his hammer to, I mean, it might have involved a whole lot more than that, but and reviving his oxen might not be as far-fetched as it sounds, folk. If they knew more than we did. Again, there are explanations of some of this stuff. I don't believe that we should say they were primitive and they were lacking in knowledge and they were naive and they were filled with phobia, megalomania. These are toned words that really deride them. I believe that they deserve far more credit than that.
What year was the woolly mammoth thing? Wasn't that
Woolly
like
mammoths
99
disappeared
or 2000?
about, some people believe up to 10,000 years ago. I mean, they did disappear. I mean, there's still a whole bunch of frozen ones in the Arctic region, in Siberia and Alaska. And, but I read an article about one time that what happened, this area froze, and the sea was still warm, so the mammoths made the mistake during the Ice Age of fleeing north to the warm waters of the ocean, and then the ocean froze and they were just surrounded and had no place to go. The species that went ahead and went south in spite of this area here turning colder, this mountainous region would have turned cold first when the ice age hit. And this would have turned cold last because the water would have kept it warm, so they went north to get warm. And that was their fatal mistake. Now that's the last article I read on them. Otherwise, I've read a whole lot of articles that the Earth shifted on its axis and cold winds blew down over the Arctic. There was a lot of soft ground. They fell into the soft ground and froze to death.
When was the cloning about?
Oh, the cloning was done about 30 years ago, 1980. Yeah, it's been a while. Someone in my class had heard about it, but they did get a baby woolly mammoth with a surrogate mother, but it did not last long. Maybe someday. The thing about cloning, it's really tricky. Only about 0.1% of any attempts to clone an animal actually results in a healthy animal. The most famous cloning being a sheep named Dolly. Yes, but it was as old as its parents. And that was a big problem because generally babies start all over again and are not as old. But genetically, it was as old as its parents were, which means basically if the parents were 30 sheep years old, the clone started out at age 30 itself. So that way it's guaranteed to not live long. All right, we've got to move on. Socrates. Essentially, where I left off last time, and I promised you some really shocking things about Socrates, which I will give in a minute. But one thing I want to mention about Socrates, there's an expert professor somewhere in New England who spent his life studying Socrates. He said everywhere he goes, people ask him, did Socrates really say that if you give people too much freedom, they will start to demand more law and order? So he posted on a webpage, and here's what he posted, that Socrates said through Plato, not that he wrote anything himself that we have read that we can read, but he said that he sees in a city of Athens, the animals don't even obey their masters. You tell a horse to move, and he might move if he wants to. The dogs don't come when their masters call them. The children don't obey their parents. The wives, as soon as it's sunlight, they get out and go and roam the streets and do whatever they please, and they don't listen to their husbands. And the slaves don't obey their masters very well either. He said, given enough time, people get fed up with a society like this, and they start demanding that there be some kind of order. And in other words, he did say something on the order of give people too much freedom, and after a while they'll start demanding a dictatorship, which is what the Greek democracies tended to experience. Too much freedom, they'll start demanding some kind of order. Now, when I'm researching Socrates, and I do every once in a while, I have noticed that only about 1 out of 4 web pages will mention what I'm about to tell you. I mean, most of the websites, they're admirers of Socrates and think of him as a free thinker. Well, if you think of a free thinker as being a man who has freed himself from all types of spirituality, Socrates did not qualify. Socrates was in fact one of the most spiritually minded men who ever lived. According to Plato and Xenophon and Thucydides, Socrates claimed to be buddies with a demon. Now, in those days, the Greek word demon, and the English word, always means a very bad entity, a very bad spirit. In Socrates' day, he said that his demon was his buddy, and his demon was keeping him from committing immorality. And his demon was whispering all this philosophy into his ear that he heard. He once said he visited the palace of the demon. It was the most magnificent palace ever seen. The demon was tended to by a whole lot of servants and lived in a whole lot of luxury. But this demon would go on whispering. Now, I want to say this. 90 to 95% of the world's people, including most Christians and practically all Muslims, believe that the Muslims call them genie, by the way, but they believe that there are spirit entities that go around and influence our lives. So Socrates, in this area of his life, was in tune with 90 to 95% of humanity. Now, this subject now I'm going to have to tell you I'm a little bit afraid of, and I always say this as an apology, but what kind of iniquities was this demon keeping Socrates from? Now, essentially, folk, and your book will mention this, the Greeks were homosexual. The Greeks practiced the type of homosexuality that we have at least still outlawed in this country, men with young boys. It seems apparent that Socrates had the temptation to have sex with young boys, as did most Greek men at that time, at least the ones we have a record of. And he believed this was wrong, so to fight the temptation, he depended on the help of this demon to remind him, to whisper into his ear, to keep him away from the young boys. Now, some of the young boys were his pupils. Again, as far as we know, Socrates never engaged in a homosexual act with a young boy. Now, also, a lot of people believe that to help fight the urge, Socrates is known to have married, and his marriage produced 3 sons. We know the names of their sons. We know the name of his wife. Some of the later accounts say that Socrates' wife was a very hard to get along with woman, but the original sources, Xenophon, Thucydides, and Plato, do not say that about her. But then again, the persons who do say that may have had access to sources that have since been lost to us. But basically, according to the sources, his wife was what we call a shrew, a very hard to get along with woman. But again, the original sources, the persons who would have known her, do not say that. Now, on that same lines, all 3 of these men were known to be homosexual. Of all of these 3 men, Socrates is the only one who married. And you have a progression in this area. You have a man who believes it's wrong and fights it. That's one generation. The next generation at least justifies it. He does not attempt to fight it, Plato, but he justifies it. Then the next generation, he doesn't even attempt to justify it. To him, it's already justified. He doesn't attempt to fight it. It's just simply accepted as being the absolute norm, and there's no reason to even argue about it anymore. That's the progression, folk. All right. There's another progression on scientific lines, which I'll get into in a few minutes, that these 3 men have that we might find in modern times. Anyway, if any of you want to discuss this issue, I'll tell you quite frankly, there's few times I say that, but this is one issue I simply do not want to discuss. But I don't want to sweep it under the rug either. I think you need to know this about him. Anyway, Socrates was suspected of having leanings toward the Spartans. And again, a lot of your leaders are sometimes suspected of leaning toward the opposite side. When I was a kid, we would suspect that our leaders were pro-communist. And Richard Nixon used to run on a platform that my opponent is a communist. Then he got to be president, and he made more overtures to the communist world than all previous presidents combined. And made people like my dad wonder if he were not communist himself. And yes, we sometimes wonder if our present leaders are in cahoots with our enemies, the terrorists. Again, we don't know that, but we sometimes wonder. In the case of Socrates, they wondered if he was not really secretly in cahoots with the Spartans, because the Spartans had more law and order than you found in the city of Athens. Now, what turned people against Socrates was, folk, you can take any side of any issue you want to. Socrates had a habit of stopping people on their way to court and saying, hey, tell me your case. And then he'd try to convince them that their case was the worst case and their opponent was the better. And even when he came up to their opponent, they were wrong also. The people got a little bit tired of this, to say the least. And then they finally got him on a charge. The charge officially was corrupting the youth. Here's the situation. Athens had just lost its war with Sparta. And the war was a lot over ideals. There was not a war for territory. It was a war between freedom, democracy, and totalitarianism on the other hand. And unfortunately for the Athenians, who thought that their freedom was the greatest thing ever, their democracy was the greatest government ever, the Athenians had lost. And they were really concerned that their youth not be turned aside as a result of, hey, you know, your daddy, we lost the war, but we still believe in what we believe. And the youth would say, well, if your democracy is so great, how come you lost? Then up comes Socrates, who questions everything about Athenian values. And I'll say this, being a parent myself, when I was a kid, I what is so wrong about corrupting the youth? Then I became a parent myself, and I want to, will my children grow up and really follow in my footsteps? Will they develop my values, or will they go out and join some fanatical cult, or will they go out and become terroristic or become outlaws or gang members or whatever? I mean, so you begin to be fearful that, hey, my children might grow up and disgrace me somehow. So these people were becoming paranoid. I mean, having lost a war, they were more paranoid perhaps than we are today. So they tried Socrates before the Council of 500 on the charge of corrupting the youth. And they found him guilty. Now, the initial vote was something like 260 to 240. I mean, it was a close vote, but it was a guilty vote. Now, everybody who has studied believes if Socrates would have treated the council with respect, say, all right, the vote of guilty, they took two votes. The first vote, yes, he's guilty of corrupting the youth. Then they had to decide on what should a penalty be. Well, they could have fined him, they could have put him in prison, or they could have told him to keep quiet, or they could have exiled him. But then he started, you might say, smart-mouthing, treating the council with contempt. So when they took the second vote, they voted for the death penalty by something like 400 to 100. It was really overwhelming. And that's surprising because with the initial vote being so close, you would have thought that the penalty would have been a lot less. But instead, Socrates somewhat brought his death on himself. And Socrates appears to have been really surprised at the vote, but he didn't think he'd done anything that badly. Nevertheless, some people, his friends, plotted to help him escape. Socrates said, no, this would be wrong, I won't. On the day of his execution, it said he cheerfully drank the hemlock and died. Now, I want to remind you, folks, a few things. Socrates was already 70 years old, and he said, what do I have to look forward to in life? I used to be able to outrun almost everybody, but now young men who I once could beat in a foot race can now beat me. Men whom I once could beat in a wrestling match can now beat me. And all I have to look forward to is losing complete control of my bladder and bowel functions, or losing control of my mind, or walking on a cane. There's not much left for my life anyway. And as for death, he said, I don't fear death. I know it'll bring either two things, either complete annihilation, I'll become nothing, or I'll become a god, whatever. I do not know, but I'm about to find out. And death is inevitable anyway, and it's going to happen to me fairly soon anyway, so what do I have to lose? So that was another, he took, at the orders of the council, he took his own life before he had time to really, really decline. If he had lived much longer, of course, inevitably he would have physically and mentally declined even more, which he was not looking forward to. Now, he had no sooner died than what the other city-states all around began pointing their fingers at and saying, naughty, naughty, you killed an innocent man. And folk, as much as I believe I'd have found Socrates to be obnoxious if he were alive today, I have to say he had done nothing worthy of the death penalty. So the trial and the conviction were, even in my opinion, unjust. And it's the standard view of most historians. The view of the time, too. When the Athenians thought about it, they thought, hey, what have we done? So they elevated Socrates to the status of martyr, raised him up to a high status, and made him a great hero. He was, again, like so many of these sages, honored far more in his death than he ever had been in his life. Now, one of his pupils, star pupil, was Plato. He actually had several pupils, but Plato is remembered for his philosophy of idealism. In other words, there's an ideal world that this world is but a bad shadow of. In the ideal world, nobody would ever grow old. And even though they didn't have automobiles, let's keep it in mind. Your car, once you made it and put together, would never rust, never need repair. It would always stay in the same condition, tip-top shape, and never run out of gasoline. The ideal world. A world of no rust, no decay, no rot, no untidiness. And you might think this sounds like heaven, and you might think this paved the way for Christianity, except it actually hindered the development of Christianity that came later. In that the Greeks when the Christians came along preaching a resurrection, the Greeks said, who would want to resurrect this corrupt body? Why, this body is corrupted. And who'd want to resurrect it? So it actually hindered the spread of Christianity that came later. Now, Plato's philosophy of idealism led some people to blame their bad deeds on their body. In other words, my outer man is corrupt, but inside I'm clean. And as long as I'm clean inside, it doesn't matter what my outer self does. My outer self just might do anything. But as long as I'm clean on the inside, I'm okay. Each of you can decide for yourself what you think of that kind of philosophy. But a lot of the Greeks adopted it, making excuses for their bad deeds. Oh, it's my corrupt body. And once I lay down this corrupt body in death, I'll be free from all the corruption. Again, it made them not want or not look forward to a resurrection, because who'd want to come back to such a corrupt world or a corrupt body? Again, this is Plato's view, not necessarily mine. Plato is famous for his saying, I'll digress a little bit. Most of you can probably tell, folk, I have really bad penmanship. Most people who go through 5 or more years of college like I did wind up with bad penmanship, but in my case, my penmanship always has been bad. I can write pretty well when I slow down and want to. But now I was asked to teach 10-year-old students many years ago how to write. So here's what I would tell them. I quote the philosopher Plato when he would say to his followers, do as I say, but don't do as I do. It was all I could do in this case. Now, I didn't tell that to my children unless I was trying to teach them morality. But that was the way Plato taught morality to his followers. Do as I say, but don't do as I do. Now, Plato is also famous for giving us the story of Atlantis. And according to the story, Atlantis was somewhere out here beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The Atlantic Ocean is named after Atlantis, as is the city of Atlanta. There have been many a person trying to search for the city. According to Plato, by the way, Plato had been to Egypt and gotten this story from the Egyptians. The Greeks told Plato that Atlantis had been a very, very advanced race, a race of supermen, a race of titans. And they had come in and tried to take over the world, and then the Egyptians said to Plato, you Greeks are the ones who stopped them. Now, you don't remember it. You've forgotten about it, but you're the ones who stopped the Atlantans. Then the Atlantans went home in defeat, and all of a sudden a big catastrophe hit them, and their whole area, their whole land sunk into the sea and is buried under the ocean. Well, we've tried to find Atlantis. It might be Crete, where the island of Crete was overrun by a tidal wave, or the island of Thera, which was overrun by a tidal wave, but if we believe it was beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Recently, some people believe that they found a sunken city, that the sonar showed straight lines, which does not occur in nature. This was about 5 or so years ago, but others said, no, there's no such straight lines there, there's no such city there. But it was supposedly found in the region of Spain. There have been persons who have tried to look for Atlantis over in here, and even as far away as the East Indies Islands. The size of Atlantis was defined, and it was a fairly large place, about the size of the state of Rhode Island, or maybe a little bit bigger than that. But it was, you think of Rhode Island as being small, which it is, but nevertheless, to the Greeks, the people living at that time, was fairly large. Fact is, we do not know if Atlantis is, or wherever was, a real place or not. Now, their idea that it was a super advanced, had a super advanced civilization, that fits in with what I believe about our ancient ancestors. That the farther back you go, the more advanced. And this, by the way, is, you'll find in the, if you read the next assignment, the next paper assignment, Mohenjo-Daro, the farther back you go in time, the more advanced they seem to have become. All right. Now, Plato's most brilliant student was Aristotle. And with Aristotle rejected Plato's idea of idealism. There's a famous painting of Plato arguing with Aristotle. In the painting, Plato has his hand pointed toward heaven, and Aristotle, standing over here, has his other hand pointing down toward the earth beneath. Aristotle telling Plato that the real solution to mankind's existence lies at the earth beneath our feet, and Plato saying it lies in a heaven above. Again, folk, I told you there'd be another progression. The progression is from more spiritual to completely materialistic, and this represents the way the Greek mindset was going at the time. At the time Aristotle came along, the Greeks were becoming more skeptical in matters of religion. And they were beginning to question the existence of the gods, to question the existence of even an afterlife, to believe that all that there was always material. And Aristotle more or less took up the belief that all that there was the material. And again, this debate is still going on in the year 2015. Now, I want to say this about the Greeks. They went through a couple generations where they were unbelieving, skeptical, and then all of a sudden came another generation of Greeks who were super, extremely religious. Now, I'm old enough to have seen this phenomenon. You find two parents, mom and dad, who just don't care anything about religion. Their children become religious fanatics. Or vice versa. The parents are super enthused about it, their children become indifferent. A lot of times these things go across the generations. But anyway, there was a progression here that seemingly less and less interest in religion that eventually came to an end. Before I leave Plato, there is something else I must mention about him. In his belief about government, Plato wrote a book called The Republic. Plato was hard against democracy. But the difference between democracy and republic is a republic, only the best of people, the brightest of people, participate in government, and your average Joe citizen is told what to do by the few who are enlightened. In other words, the ideal government would be the government of the few, the enlightened, the more educated, the ones known to be more brilliant. Now, Plato also believed that men and women could associate as equals, that women should have a part in the government. I believe I have mentioned this before. From this idea, we get the word Platonic, that men and women can associate as friends only without becoming romantically involved. And again, folk, each of you can make up your own minds what you believe about this. As I get older, I become more and more convinced that men and women are too much different and cannot associate as friends for very long. But if any of you want to disagree, you're welcome to. I say this kind of tongue-in-cheek. My wife, for many, many years, believed, oh, it's okay as long as we're just friends. After a while, she kind of came around, but you can't be friends. We're just friends with members of the opposite sex. And for those of you who are married or may get married, I want to tell you, when you and a member of the opposite sex are just friends, now, be careful. That's where you're on the verge. You don't realize how close you are when you no, when you're just friends. Oh my.
I don't know. I have 4 sisters, so I've always had a lot of guy friends because I have so many sisters. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know.
That I'm friends with. So I don't know.
It depends on what you call a close friendship, too, or just an acquaintance. And again, to each his own. Plato believed that men and women could associate as equals. What I noticed when I was single for a long time, sooner or later, one of you, whether the man or the woman, is going to do something that just simply was devastating to the friendship. What one gender considers to be trite and trivial and unimportant, the other gender considers to be unbearable. If you haven't run into this already, you probably inevitably will. Or one of you would start liking the other and the other one doesn't. There have been a few exceptions. Most notably, the one that comes to mind is J. Edgar Hoover was friends with a woman for some 40 years, and they never became romantic. But then again, Hoover was accused of being J. Edgar Hoover was the director of the FBI for some 40-some years when I was a kid. He was accused of being a transvestite, a cross-dresser, and possibly homosexual also. We do not know any of that for sure. I can tell you a hair-raising story about a young lady who was in my class when I was in college. And, all right, the professor, I'll tell you, the professor was unmarried. But she went after one of her professors, and this chase went on for 40 years. At the end of 40 years, she finally gave up. By this time, she was too old to attract a man. I can tell you a male friend of mine who went after a woman for 9 years, and during those 9 years, he turned from being a young-looking man to a middle-aged man. He never did remarry. He's now about 70. But he was he and I coached basketball together. Fairly close friend of mine at one time. And one of the things that kept me single for so long was doing some of the same things, folk. Set limits, and then if the person doesn't see it your way, move on. Or you can lose your youth going after someone who is simply not available. I see a few heads nodding. Maybe you've seen some of the same thing. Most of you are much younger than I am, but if you haven't seen it yet, you will. All right, so much for Plato. Now, on to Aristotle. Aristotle is remembered for his studies of nature, and one of the things he did was classify animals. Now, the subject of taxonomy, what we call classification of animals, we try to base it on evolution. But there are problems with it, folk. We say that mammals do not lay eggs until we find some animals that have fur and are warm-blooded, red blood, that lay eggs. The monotreme is one example. With a duckbill, has a beak like a bird, but it has fur, so it's class of mammal. We have fossilized birds that apparently had teeth. Today's birds, no bird today does. Aristotle classified animals according to whether or not they flew. He classified the bat as a bird. Today's taxonomists do not. Bats are classified as mammals in spite of the fact that they have wings and fly. Aristotle classified animals according to whether they gave birth to young live or laid eggs. You may know that there are certain types of fish that bear live young. Most fish lay eggs. Some fish bear their young live. Most notably, the guppy. Anybody in here know what a guppy is by any chance? Okay. I'm surprised at how few college students know what guppies are. Just yesterday, folks, my day off, after I had my haircut, I bought some.
Mine are always having babies.
Yeah, well, I've never had, it's been years since I had a pair of guppies have a baby. But they bear their young live. They don't lay eggs. There are some animals that we try to class, particularly some fish, I've heard, that scientists don't know where to put them, so just put them in a certain class because we don't know where else they go. They have this characteristic puts them here, but that characteristic puts them there, and another character, and, well, they're just a mixture of everything. We don't know where they go. But taxonomy is an interesting science, to say the least. I'm not saying it's, but it becomes, after a while, got on the fringes to where you simply cannot reasonably classify your plants or your animals. In the case of the slime mold, when I was in junior high school, they told us scientists don't even know whether that thing is a plant or an animal. Then I've heard in the case of the mushroom, we don't know if it's alive or not. It's just a computer program that's happened to put itself together. I suspect you should think of it as being alive, but it has, anyway, it has its problems. All right, anyway, leaving that, Aristotle is famous, though, also for a lot of his mistakes. His most notorious mistake, folk, every genius, and I think Aristotle was a genius, will sometimes say things or do things that are utterly idiotic. Aristotle observed a feather dropping and concluded that lighter objects fall at a slower rate than heavy objects. Now, if you pick up a 10-pound bowling ball and a half-a-pound pebble and drop them both, which one's going to land first?
In a vacuum, they're both in the ground. with resistance, the bowling ball's better than, you know.
Actually, the bowling ball will, in air, the bowling ball will actually land slightly less than because the wind will hold it up a little bit. But you get in a vacuum. In a vacuum, a feather falls like a rock. Now, because of what Aristotle said, one of our astronauts that went to the moon carried along a feather. He picked up a moon rock, fairly heavy, and the feather, and dropped them both. And of course, on the moon's gravity, they don't fall as fast as you do on Earth, but the feather and the rock both hit the ground at the same time. On Earth, they pumped some air out of a vacuum and used a robot and dropped the feather and a heavy lead ball. The lead ball and the feather fell at the same rate. Objects fall at a speed, and are near the Earth surface at a speed of 32 feet per second squared, regardless of their weight, unless they're held up by air. Otherwise, any object is going to fall at the same speed. How Aristotle could make this mistake, we don't know. Aristotle made a few other book mentions that Aristotle had no use for women, which led to it being hard on family life. Your book mentions that he cannot be commended for what he said about women and family. Unlike Plato, who believed men and women were equal, Aristotle thought that women had no other use other than bearing children. Otherwise, were useless for anything else. This is him now. And also in a field of banking and finance, which is so much a part of any advanced society, Aristotle believed that money should never be borrowed or loaned out with interest. He said money is sterile, it can never beget more money. Out the window goes our investing system in the stock market, hoping for gain. Out the window goes our putting extra money we have in a bank, hoping it will accrue some interest. And again, folks, nobody has any incentive to loan money unless they feel like they're going to get more back than what they loan. That's how banks stay in business. And without banks, we cannot buy our cars, most of us. We cannot buy our houses. We cannot buy our property. Without banks, you can't have a complex economy. Hey, I spent 27 years at Lockheed. Supposing Lockheed could only have paid me when they sold a plane. I might have worked, one time I'd have worked maybe 10, 11 months without receiving a check. Then when they sold a few planes, finally, they got the bugs ironed out and sold the planes. They all had all of us, you line up and we're going to pay you all. And we get all this money in gold and silver coins, which we have to be really careful, hoping nobody would steal it on the way. You know, actually Lockheed deposited my paycheck straight back in the bank. I never saw my paycheck except the stuff that was mailed to me. Same way here. Hopefully most of you are probably doing the same thing. Convenient way to get paid. But, again, think of the effect it had on the local economy. Nobody, in the city of Marietta, the restaurants have to close. The dry cleaning, all the businesses have to close until finally Lockheed's workers got paid. Oh boy, it'd be a big celebration. Lockheed's workers finally got paid today. After several months, they paid them all, and now we have millions of dollars pumped in local economy. We all wound up spending it in the first week or so, and then we're broke again until the next paycheck came. That's what life would be without banks. And folks, it's impossible. As it is, Lockheed could simply write us a check because they had credit at the bank. And what if they hadn't sold a plane? Oh, they had credit. I had this argument with people who say you should never borrow money and never go into debt. Well, again, if Lockheed would never been willing to go into debt, the chaos that I'm talking about would have happened. Banks is what keep the economy flowing along smoothly. Aristotle, without realizing it, did not know that he was simply setting up to where a big factory that builds huge aircraft could never exist under his system. Simply couldn't. But he did not know that at the time. Again, he made his share of blunders. But, folks, there was a progression downward. And I don't know if I said that to this class or not, but as I see it, these three men, their philosophy was adopted. All right. Aristotle taught Alexander the Great. Basically, the philosophy of these three men wound up destroying Greece. Then it wound up destroying the Hellenistic society that Alexander started, it came after. It wound up being adopted by Rome and wound up destroying Rome also. What was wrong with it? Among other things, the feeling that banks should not exist, that was part of it. The other side of it was the feeling that the material world that we live in is inferior and we should shuck it, we should shun it, we should avoid it. And also let's blame our outer selves on all of our faults and failures because inside we're clean anyway. It had its problems that wound up destroying everything it touched. But it sounded great, sounded good, and was embraced by a whole lot of folk. All right. So much for these men. I know I've spent a lot of time with them, but you might can tell their philosophies somewhat fascinate me. Now, getting back, leaving that, there were the Epicureans and the Stoics. The Epicureans, I'm not going to write all this down. Well, they eat, drink. Said, let us eat, drink, and make merry. That's what life's about. Let's all throw a big party while we're alive because tomorrow we're going to die. So why not just get the most enjoyment out of life, eat, drink, and make merry? The Stoics, these were often your community leaders. They said, no, let us, while we're alive, store and get gain. Get all we can. Make the world better, try to turn over to the next generation a better world than the one we found. But they had a few problems. They said, don't have very many friends because friends will hurt you. The Epicureans just make buddies of everybody, live in harmony with everybody. The Stoics said, no, only make a few friends because friendships bring you down. And of course, I can't say enough that hanging around with the wrong crowd can do a lot to bring you down. About these philosophies, folks, there's a kernel of truth in every one of them. And a kernel of error in every one of them. And today, a lot of our scholars have admitted we don't know which philosophy to follow because every one of them has its good and its bad. All right. Leaving the subject of philosophy for a while and getting back to politics. After Sparta had defeated Athens during the Peloponnesian War, the Spartans believed that they could take over and unite all of Greece. Well, they tried, but the Spartans went to a battle. Well, I'm not going to write it down, but the Battle of Leuctra. The reason I remember, I had a pupil who was been in the army do a paper on the Battle of Leuctra. In effect, the Spartans were out-generaled or outmaneuvered. The Thebans, a city-state that had not been prominent until now, who only had 6,000 men, defeated a Spartan army of 10,000 men by sending 50 men deep, who was in ranks 50 men deep, to hit the Spartan right. They hit the Spartan right flank, which was supposed to be the best of the Spartan army, but they hit them with 50 men deep, because the Spartan right flank was only about 8 or 10 men deep. They destroyed the Spartan flank. Then they were able to move in and get behind the Spartans and just hack away at them. And the Spartans were so disciplined, no, we don't turn and fight, we're going to face the front, which was a bad move there. But basically, the Spartans were overtrained and over-disciplined. Then when the Spartan general saw what had happened, he did the unthinkable in the minds of many Spartan soldiers. He ordered a retreat. Now, folks, there was nothing wrong with retreat. The thing to do was, hey, this general saw, I've been outmaneuvered. What I want to do is pull them in back, reorganize them, get them reorganized, and then hit and fight again. Hey, that's sound military strategy, except some of the Spartan men said, hey, we never have retreated before. We Spartans don't retreat. We're not going to retreat now. So half the Spartans wouldn't retreat. The other half did. The half that didn't retreat got annihilated. Maybe serves them right to disobey orders. And the Battle of Leuctra was a severe setback. Well, the Spartan soldiers went home weary and sick. When they got home, they found that their slaves had gotten together with a couple of other city-states, and by this time the slaves outnumbered them by 4 to 1. What happened? The Spartans kept dwindling in numbers. The training was bad, and they didn't allow their babies to grow up. The Spartans kept dwindling in numbers, and the slaves kept getting bigger and bigger in numbers, until finally these helots from Messenia, where helot means Spartan slave, they found that they were standing there ready for them, And the Spartans, again, had to do the unthinkable, actually negotiate a treaty with the Helots because they couldn't fight them at this point. I mean, they were sore and weak and wounded. And here were these Helots outnumbering them 4-1 with a few other city-states who didn't believe that the treatment of the Messenians was just. So from that point on, a lot of the Helots then who had fled Messenia, they saw that, hey, things are getting better in our homeland, so they began to come back. Then an earthquake hit Sparta on top of that and destroyed 25,000 of them, which meant that the Helots, the earthquake barely touched the Helots, which meant the Helots outnumbered even more. So Sparta had to worry about its own home life. And then finally a Spartan commander realized, hey, we just don't have the numbers to take over and run all of Greece. Eventually, though, the Greeks sided up. Two sides, every Greek city-state joined up with one side or the other, and they said to each other, whoever wins this will rule all of Greece. The battle was a tie. Nobody won. So Greece was to remain disunited, and this will take us up to, and I just realized I'm out of time, this will take us up to Philip of Macedon. Whom we'll take up with Monday.